Well, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I did just come down the road, which is great. And we have been working with David and Georgian Bay Forever now for just a little bit, and we're super fortunate actually, because this is something that my PhD student, who's actually in the audience, Lisa Ertl, who should really be giving this talk today because she really is becoming the microfiber expert. But it's something that we have been wanting to do for a while, and now we have this opportunity to collaborate and actually do this pilot in a city. So we'll talk about that. But before, I thought I would just spend some time talking about the issue and how it relates to microfibers. So I came to Toronto about 3 years ago. I am a professor at the University of Toronto, but I'm pretty new. But I've been working on the issue of plastic pollution for a while, for about a decade, and I wanted to share with you a little bit first about just how the issue has changed and what we've learned over the years before I really launch into microfibers. And so in our lab, and I think David mentioned this in his really nice introduction, that I do spend a lot of time talking to policymakers, and the reason is because I did not get into science because I was just interested in science. I love advancing basic knowledge, of course, but I became a scientist because I recognized the value in using scientific information to inform decision making, right? So that things decisions are made based on facts. So we spend a lot of time working on the sources of plastic into the ocean, including microfibers, and also into the lakes, the contamination once it gets into our water bodies, and the impacts. And we spend a lot of time taking that information and trying to get it written in a way that it's accessible to everyone, and then putting it in the hands of the decision makers so that hopefully good decisions are made. So for me, I got interested in this issue because I learned about the garbage patch. I was studying at the University of California in San Diego as an undergraduate. I was studying abroad in Australia, researching marine biology. I loved the ocean. I wanted to spend my time researching the oceans. And I was also very obsessed always with waste and trash and litter. Don't ask me why. And so my teacher said, if you could research whatever you wanted, what would it be? And write a proposal. And so I Googled trash and I Googled ocean, the two things I loved, and I found the garbage patch. And I stumbled across this article from 2006, written by Ken Weiss in the LA Times. It is a Pulitzer Prize-winning article introducing the garbage patch to the world. But so the garbage patch is what introduced a lot of us to this issue. And they described it as this island of trash twice the size of Texas. We've now learned it's not an island of big things you can scoop out. We've learned more that it's a bunch of small stuff. And I'll talk about that in a second. But at this time, in 2006, this is the amount of papers that were published on the issue of plastic over the decades. And you can see that it was creeping along very slowly until the garbage patch became really publicized, and now it's increasing immensely. And if I change that bar to 2018, it would be a lot higher. So we have learned a ton, and I'd say the biggest thing we've learned is that it's not just about the garbage patches, as David said. It's not just about the middle of the ocean. It's really a global thing. And that while there are big pieces of plastic floating about in the lakes and in the oceans, when you truly look down in the middle of the garbage patch on a calm day, it looks like the picture in the bottom right-hand corner. In that most of the stuff floating by the boat when you're in the middle of the garbage patch is tiny little bits of microplastics. And so the first time I went to the garbage patch in 2008 or 9, I had this realization that as an ecologist, this small stuff could be worse because now it has this opportunity to contaminate every level of the food chain, and the reality is that it has. And so microplastics, as we know today, are a global contaminant the way PCBs and pesticides and other industrial chemicals like flame retardants are a global pollutant. It is in our oceans, yes, and it is on the seafloor and the surface and everywhere in between. But it is also in our local streams, in our lakes that we know and love, in the atmosphere, in soil, you name it, we find it. And so the real question is, does it matter? And so the first thing is it actually contaminating our animals? And so we know for plastic pollution, big and small, that more than 800 species have been recorded to interact with it in some way, whether it's ingestion, entanglement, being smothered by it, whatever it is. For microplastics, as we learn more, we know that more than 220 species have been found with it in their stomach. And while I sit here today and I give you that number of 220, we know that in our lab, with Lisa's work included, we're sitting on species that aren't on this list that we've sampled and found microplastic in their stomach. And microplastic itself is incredibly diverse. So So just like we think of pesticides, there are many different types of pesticides. There are many different types of microplastics. And so when we look in these animals, we get to see this diversity that we see. And so here we're really talking about microfibers. So I just want to kind of go into it by showing you it is one type of microplastic, just like beads. Microbeads are one type of microplastic. So what is a microplastic? It is literally a piece of plastic debris or plastic trash less than 5 millimeters in size. It comes from something that made it that small, like a microbead in personal care product, which we call a primary microplastic, or it's broken down from a plastic product into little bits, which we call a secondary microplastic. We then often categorize it by shape, why. It helps us understand where it came from and maybe something about impact. So we often say, is it a fragment? Is it a broken down piece of something? Is it a perfect sphere? Did it start as a microplastic? Is it a fiber? Did it come from clothing, textiles, upholstery, whatever it is? And then it's made of all kinds of different polymer types, lots of different chemical additives, and of course it makes up lots of different sizes. The one we're going to spend most of our time talking about today is a secondary microplastic that is fibrous in shape, that is made of lots of different types of polymers, but mostly polypropylene is that PP, which are a lot of like the fishing ropes and nets, as well as nylon, acrylic, and polyester PET, which are in a lot of clothing. And what we're mostly focusing on today is probably clothing, since we're talking about microfibers from washing. But I can tell you from my years of work that what I've learned is that microfibers are really among the most common type of plastic that we find in the ocean. So when I sample a fish, when I sample sediment, when we sample whatever it is in our lab, the majority of those counts are microfibers. And this is in many different ecosystems, in the Arctic sea ice, on the sea floor, on the surface of the ocean, but they're also among the most common in wildlife. And the one thing that I will add, and this is not to be scary, but it is to just show this reality, is that it's also what we find in our seafood and in our drinking water. Now, we don't know how that impacts humans, but what I hope this drives home, and the point is that literally the mismanagement of our waste and the use of our materials and how we've been using them has come back to haunt us in our own seafood and drinking water, and we're literally eating our trash. So this is where I think of how can we improve our materials or our waste management. So going back to the wildlife and just talking about some of our work in terms of knowing that the majority of what we see are microfibers, and also sharing some local work. This is some work from Keenan Munot, who works in our lab. She did some work during her master's with the Ministry of the Environment and University of Toronto, where she sampled fish from nearshore Lake Ontario. And you can see here that in all of the fish that she sampled, the majority of what she found are microfibers. Now to figure out how many per fish, you've got to divide the second column by the fiber column, because that's the number of fish. But you can see that it's anywhere from one piece, and then it actually ranges to upwards of 20 or 30. Now, in Lisa's work, who's sitting in the room, she has been sampling fish from offshore, Lake Huron and Lake Ontario, and she's found little pieces of debris in 100% of her fish. And the majority of them, 97%, are microfibers. Remember, these are offshore, so they're less close to what's coming and spewing right off of the land. And she finds sometimes up to about 70 fibers per fish. So we know that these are quite ubiquitous. Now, I also work with Bob Andrews in civil engineering at University of Toronto, and he works on drinking water. And so we sample drinking water from the treatment plants from Lake Erie, Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, and I'm going to show you some results from a plant on Lake Erie. And I honestly, naively believed, why would there be microplastic in drinking water? It's filtered, it's treated in such a way that this is impossible. Well, then when I learned more about the drinking water process, I learned that maybe it's not impossible. And so what we find are lots of particles in drinking water, and so what you're looking at are different types of particles, whether it's a film or a fiber, a fragment or the total. In the water, the raw water that comes into the plant, the settled water that lets the particles settle, the filtered water, and then what goes literally to distribution, which is the finished water. These are not all microplastic, these are just the total particle count, and then when you break it down into what is synthetic and what is not, you can see that about 40 to 50% of the particles we find are natural, and that In the finished water, that number is higher, which is good, less microplastic, but we do find about 12 pieces of fiber and 3 fragments per liter of finished water, and these are the types of polymers that they make up. So you can see that it is even contaminating our drinking water. Now again, we don't know what that means for human health, but it suggests that maybe we should try to keep it out of our drinking water. So where does it come from? Well, it comes from lots of different sources, and so we're going to focus most of this talk and our work on washing machines because we know for certain that this is a source of microfibers, but they also come from lots of different types of textiles that we use, like carpets and upholstery and furniture. Also, we get them in wet wipes and wastewater treatment plants. We have little bits of toilet paper and wet wipes and all kinds of fun things that we won't talk about. And then cigarette butts have cellulose acetate fibers in them. But I think the microfiber work was really introduced by a colleague of mine named Mark Brown, who basically was finding lots of microfibers near his lab in the UK, and he was curious where they came from, and he knew he was sampling near an effluent pipe, and he's quite a smart guy, and he thought, well, I kind of wonder if some of these are coming from the washing machine. So he did laundry in his lab, and they started to look and quantify the amount of fibers in the effluent. And this work was published in 2011, and here we are in 2018, so it took a while for this to really catch on, and he's been kind of talking about this for a while, but since then, lots of work has been done, other researchers, to show that yes, microfibers, no surprise, they're synonymous with laundry lint, end up in the wash and go out the pipe of the washing machine. And by nature of how they're treated at the wastewater treatment plant, just like microbeads, some end up in the environment. And so people have now done lots of washing experiments to try to understand how much comes off of our clothing. Does it matter what type of textile we use, what type of washing machine, whether we use detergents? And we have a washing machine in our lab, so we've been trying to look at some of this stuff as well. Mostly though, just trying to quantify it and think about mitigation strategies. So oftentimes when people talk about what are the source of microfibers, they point to the wastewater treatment plants. And that's because this is where a lot of the wastewater goes. So the wastewater treatment plants are really the unsung heroes of the world. I really truly believe that, because if they weren't there, we wouldn't have such clean water. But they're also the middleman, right? So they're often thought of as the source. And we know we can go to the wastewater treatment plant and sample the effluent and look at how many microfibers are there and think about how much we're putting out into the water per liter and think about solutions. And so we know from looking in wastewater treatment plants, from our work, from the work of others, the microfibers are really some of the most common materials that we see. And so just to show you some local work with Sam Afey, who's also a PhD student in our lab, but also in Miriam Diamond's lab at the University of Toronto, and then standing here next to Lisa Erdl, who's in the back, who hopefully you'll all chat with today. We sampled some wastewater from the wastewater treatment plants in Toronto. So this is from North Toronto plant, Humber plant, and Ashbridges Bay. We sampled 4 liters of water, and this is the amount of, from a 24-hour composite. So we take a little bit every hour for 24 hours. And this is how much we find per liter. Those are dots next to it, so it's not 3,000, it's 30, 40, 50. But that's the amount per liter that we see, and you can see the great majority are microfibers, and the great majority of those are anthropogenic, colorful things that look like clothing. So polyester, but we also get the dyes in a lot of the clothing when we do Raman spectroscopy. But you can see that this is something that we have locally here, and it's no surprise. So when we think about them, as somebody who's thinking about what happens, where do they go, where do they come from, we also want to think about the fate. So when they end up in the water, where do they go? And so we know that if they come out of a wastewater treatment plant, they're probably going to stay in the water, maybe go into some of the animals, into the sediment, onto the surface. But we also try to think a lot about what are the other sources. So when you go home today and it's a sunny day, look through the window and where the sun comes in, take a look at the dust and look at all of the particles. And you'll notice that some of it are little bits of fibers that are just probably coming off of my scarf and coming off of the carpet and coming off of things, because we have lots of plastic around this room. So the other potential mode of transport is through atmospheric transport. So to try to understand that a little bit, and also just to understand better our Arctic ecosystem, we do some work up in the Canadian Arctic. because the Canadian Arctic, unfortunately, although it doesn't have a lot of people living in it, and so it's not a huge source itself of contaminants into the environment, by nature of the way the currents, the ocean currents move up into the Arctic and spiral around, and by nature of the way the atmospheric currents move, the Arctic is a receiver of lots of our contaminants, including microplastic. And this is because the air comes up in the temperate zone where all the people live, and it brings up and makes it rain, and then it goes up to the high desert, the Arctic, and it sinks. And so it brings it down. And so we look at what we find in the Arctic. And so we sampled water from all of these dots on this map off of the Amundsen. This is the ship on your $50 bill. I don't often have a $50 bill in my wallet, but next time you have one, take a look at the ship and you'll see. It's a Canadian Coast Guard ship. So we sampled microplastics just in surface water by dropping a bucket down into the water. And this is the number of particles we find per liter of water after we subtract the contamination from the lab. And from the air, from our sampling. And so you can see that we find less than 1 particle per liter of water, which is good. That's less than the drinking water, but we are finding it. And in fact, per liter of water, this isn't that different from the garbage patches for microplastics. So we wanted to think about the source. And so just as a fun exercise, we did a quick, simple statistic of just saying, does the number in the per liter of water actually correlate with the population around the area? And you find that it doesn't at all. And this shouldn't surprise you, because this microplastics coming from the communities up there, maybe a tiny bit, right? But they're such small communities that no, I don't think that's the major source. So to me, I would love to spend some more time studying atmospheric deposition. So we've been sampling air samples and snow samples from up there. So then you come to this question of, it's in the water, it's there, what are the effects? Everyone wants to know what are the effects. And I can tell you now, for humans, we have no idea. But for animals, we're starting to understand this a little bit. And the effects might be twofold. So one, microplastics, including microfibers, they have chemicals associated with them. They have dyes and flame retardants and sometimes bug repellent if it's outdoor gear. And so these chemicals associated with them during manufacturing themselves might leach off and potentially be cause for concern, as well as they accumulate lots of the contaminants in the environment. So when animals are exposed to microfibers, they're exposed to a physical particle, but they're also exposed to the chemicals that are associated with it. And so there's been very little work thus far to understand how microfibers impact wildlife, but you can see that they have found that it causes more mortality in Daphnia, so the bottom of the food chain, the zooplankton. We've seen that it changes growth, or HSI just means the liver was either smaller or bigger than it normally is in an animal. It can alter the feeding behavior, and then they wanted to see whether or not microfibers last in the gut of an animal longer than a microbead, and they found no difference. And so we're starting to understand, but we know very little. So if I just sum up the kind of what do we know about this issue, we know that there's widespread contamination in habitats and in wildlife. We know that there's many sources, but we really only understand the washing well, I would say. We know that effects can be chemical or physical, and we think, Lisa and I talk about this a lot, that the effects may be unique because of the shape and because the chemical contaminants associated with it are different. And also, we know there is some evidence of effect from the laboratory, but we know very little because it's only been a few studies. And we know nothing about impacts to human health. So where do we go from here, right? And this, as a scientist, this is fun because it means we get to ask more scientific questions and try to contribute to the knowledge. So between Lisa and Sam's work, we are trying to quantify and calculate loadings of microfibers and contaminants into aquatic habitats from wastewater treatment plants, and then from washing, and now they're starting to think about dryers and all of these other things because this is interesting. We're also measuring the contamination of fibers and chemicals in wildlife. That's what Lisa's been doing in her fish. And then measuring the impacts of microfibers to fish health and fish populations, as well as invertebrates. And so there are studies that Lisa's leading going on at the Ministry of the Environment that will start next week, where she'll be looking at how they impact the full life cycle of chironomid, which are an important link in the food chain right here at home in our lakes. But what we really also work on, because I do think we have enough evidence to inform solutions, is trying to understand the mitigation strategies and how they may be effective, right? So we have a washing machine in our lab, and last summer we tested a filter on a washing machine that you put outside the washing machine, and the Cora ball. Have any of you heard of the Cora ball? It's like a little ball that's supposed to collect the fibers as you wash. So we put some clothes in a washing machine. Jack and Haley did this. They were undergrads in our lab. We washed a blanket 4 times in a washing machine with absolutely no mitigation strategy. Then we washed it with the Cora ball, and then we washed with the filter. And you can see that the filter works really well, and we saw an 87% reduction by count in the effluent of the laundry water. So this says to me, we may still have a lot of questions to answer about microfibers, but oh my goodness, we could actually do something right now. And so Lisa did a back of the envelope calculation to try to think about what could this mean in a city, right? And here we are sitting in the city of Toronto, so we thought I would share this one. If we know that about 97,000 to 138,000 microfibers are in your wash load, and we do about 219 wash loads per household per year, and if there are 1,179,057 households in the city of Toronto, that we emit about 23 to 36 trillion microfibers per year into the wastewater treatment plants. So if we put filters on the homes of people, we can reduce 20 to 31 trillion microfibers. And so this, to me, is a solid impact. And so this is where it is so amazing to get to work with Georgian Bay Forever to try out a pilot in an actual place with actual people's houses, not a lab washing machine, where you put these things on washing machines within a community within Parry Sound and say, can we see a reduction in the wastewater treatment plant when we put these on 100 to 200? I'm super excited about this. Lisa and Sam are helping out and leading the charge. They'll be looking at the quantity of microfibers that are reduced, but also how it reduces chemicals going out into the lake and into the bay. So with that, I will end, and I will say thank you. And I don't work alone, so I also want to thank all of our collaborators and funders.
For those that don't know, why don't you just mention the Parry Sound project?
Sure.
Tell us who's making the filters and how do you go?
Yes.
All good questions.
So I'll let you handle the filter question.
Sure.
Since you're, so the study that we're looking at in the town of Parry Sound, we went to council and asked them if they would, support the project, number one, and they were very enthusiastic because they started to understand that this would be publishable science and the town of Parry Sound would be like on the research map. The second thing was that we needed about 100 households in the township of people that are there kind of year round. So we're going to be installing about 100 filters, and because of the great work of Amber Gordon-Bunn in our office on our fund development side and the grant writing applications that she's doing, we're hoping that we might even be able to get that number up to about 200 households. And in that way, it just makes the sample size very statistically significant when we look for the impacts. And when Lisa and I went up and with staff, with Heather and Amber, and had a tour of the wastewater treatment plant and cajoled and asked the staff there if they would help us take the water samples. It'll be very helpful if we see, the more people we have on the project, the more impact we can see at the lab, and therefore the more certainty our conclusions will be able to be drawn with, right? So it's a good project. It's going to be running over the next 2 years. The funding for it largely comes from the Environment Canada Eco Action Grant. So, and on the
filter side, what can you do at home? So you can buy a filter called the Filtrol. It is American made. There's a Canadian made version called the Lint Lover. A guy named Blair Jollymore invented quite a long time ago, thinking about septic systems. And as he learned about this issue, he's made his filters smaller and smaller. So you can buy them on the market. Yeah.
Where do you get these filters, and how do you either empty or dispose of it so you're not putting it right back in?
So we should show Amber's YouTube video of her doing it at home, but because she did an experiment. But essentially, you can get them online. So the Lint Lover or Filtrol are Googleable, and you can purchase either of them. You put it on the outside of your washing machine, so you hook it up to the hose, and then you hook it up to where it would go into your gray water pipe. And after about every 2 weeks of washing, you clean it out. If it's a Filtrol, it's a little mesh bag, and you just wipe it out and throw it in the trash. If it's a Lint Lover, you take it out and you kind of like get the scrape it off, yeah, and then put it in a coffee filter. So that's probably the best way to do it. But it's not too hard. It is obviously a little bit of extra work, but it's not that different from cleaning your lint trap on a dryer.
what extent do microfibers settle within a septic system, and what percentage goes out through the effluent that goes into the soil?
It's a very good question. So it depends on the plant and of course the level of treatment, but the data suggests that about 90 to 99% are captured in the wastewater treatment plant, which means settle into the sludge. So when sewage sludge is applied to the land, then it's applied to the land, but if not, and even in terms of the final effluent, it's a small number that goes out relatively, but unfortunately it's still a large count.
What's the ultimate plan? If you're successful with this study you're going to do at Perry Sound, the ultimate goal, where would you like to see this go? Is it regulation? Is it working with manufacturers?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So my ultimate goal, I think, would be not to tell everybody to buy a Filtrol or a lint lever, but would be to either have the white goods industry, who are the washing machine manufacturers, decide by choice to put filters in washing machines just the way we have a lint trap on a dryer, or if that's not working so well, regulate.
About 10 years ago, I read a study about the government investigating pregnant women for the amount of plastic in their bloodstream and seeing if they could connect the amount of plastics to any birth defects in the babies that were born. Do you know of anyone who has been working in the area developing a way to extract plastic from the human body? We can extract heavy metals. We have those capabilities. Do you know of any young, bright mind that's working on that other problem?
So it will be in the news next week. There is a paper coming out, or there was I think it's a conference presentation. Somebody sampled stool from 8 humans, so it's a small sample size from around the world, and found microplastics in the stool of all of the samples. In terms of sampling it in blood, I mean, we can do it just the way we do it with animals, right? So we work on those techniques in our lab, but not for humans. And so I guarantee there are people thinking about this now with humans, because that, always the trend in science is first you find the contamination, and then people start to look at the effects. So in the environment, it was contamination, 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 and in the last few years, it's been lots of studies on effects, and I think we're getting there with humans. Should I take one more or no?
No, I think that's all the